From the banks of the Colorado River in Lake Mead to the homes and businesses in Southern Nevada, welcome to Water Smarts, the podcast pumping from the heart of Las Vegas, where we engage with the experts who keep the water flowing throughout Southern Nevada. I'm Bronson Mack.
And I'm Crystal Zuelke. From how we treat it, deliver it, use it, protect it, and conserve it, the Water Smarts podcast is all about water in Southern Nevada. We hope to make you a little smarter about the one thing that keeps us all connected: water.
Hey, Crystal, how are you today?
I'm good, Bronson. It's getting to the end of the year. 2023 is almost over. Can you believe that?
The older we get, the faster the years go. I mean, people told me that would happen, but you don't realize it until you get older and all of a sudden the years are flying by, right?
I know. It's like one of the things I don't like about adulting. I also don't like paying bills, but I do have a good story. I have a good story about bills. Yeah. So I got my water bill today, and I literally opened it up right before we got onto this podcast. And I was so happy to see that my water bill decreased by half the same time last year. So full disclosure, I am a water district employee, but I'm also a water district customer. And since rates had changed in 2023, I've been paying a lot more attention to my bill and making sure that I don't get a big bill and I don't get into excessive use. So I had been consciously paying attention in the beginning of the year. I had questioned my husband about our watering clock. He is the one that sets our irrigation times here at home. And I noticed he told me he was running our drip irrigation twice a day for 30 minutes. And I said, no, you don't need to do that. We don't need that much for our desert landscaping. So I made him dial it back to just once a day on the days that we're allowed to water, for 20 to 30 minutes. And just by doing that, I'm seeing our bill every month this year has been almost half of what it was last year.
Yeah, cutting that outdoor water use, reducing that outdoor water use, being more efficient in how we're using that water outdoors, it has a direct effect on that water bill and how much we all pay for water. And I think that's a great example, Crystal. You know, and everybody needs to just make sure that they're the ones taking control of that sprinkler clock, right? Your husband has control of that sprinkler clock, knows how to adjust it. Certainly landscapers do a fine job with that, but if you need to make adjustments to it or if you need to turn it off because it's raining, you certainly need to know how to do that. But as we look at the future here in Southern Nevada, conservation continues to remain paramount. You know, climate change is going to give us a warmer and drier environment, not just here in Las Vegas, but throughout the Colorado River Basin. That has the potential to further constrain water supplies, so water efficiency is paramount. And today, to talk to us a little bit about the Colorado River Basin and how climate change is impacting water supplies, we have Colby Pellegrino, the Deputy General Manager of Resources for the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Colby, welcome back to the Water Smarts podcast.
Hey, Bronson. Hey, Crystal. Thanks for having me back.
Well, Colby, we love having you on. You always provide a wealth of information when it comes to Southern Nevada's water supply. And the last time you were on the podcast, the Bureau of Reclamation had just announced that Southern Nevada's water supply was going to be reduced for the second consecutive year because Lake Mead's water levels were so low. That meant that in 2023, our community faced a Tier 2 water shortage condition, which reduced our Colorado River water supply by 8%. That's about 25,000 acre feet, or enough water for more than 50,000 households here in Southern Nevada. And while lake levels have increased over the past year, shortage conditions remain in effect. And as we roll into next year, can you just give us an update for all of our listeners? What's Southern Nevada's water resource picture looking like as we face our third year of consecutive shortage conditions?
You know, 2023 was a really good winter on the Colorado River. We peaked our snowpack at about 160% of average, which is a phenomenal year, particularly when we look at the types of snowpack we've gotten this century. The reality is that huge 1 year provided less than a 10% increase overall in Lake Powell and Lake Mead storage. So we're still sitting at about 40% storage in those two major reservoirs. That means that we're still going to be in shortage in 2024, but like you said, a little bit less shortage than we were in 2023. Because our community has been doing such a good job at water conservation, our use still remains well below that shortage allocation. So we shouldn't be seeing any emergency measures need to be implemented in the community anytime in the near term to deal with these Colorado River shortages. So all in all, that one good year is something we'll take. We need a dozen of them for us to not have a problem, but we're thankful for the little bit of rain and the little bit of reprieve that we've gotten.
And so you bring up a good point about we need more than just one great year. So whenever there's heavy rainfall in the Las Vegas Valley, we get a lot of comments and questions on social media about whether the rain has ended the drought and why do we need to keep continuing to conserve. But that's just not enough, as you mentioned. With climate change, we're expecting a permanent aridification along the Colorado River Basin. Colby, explain what aridification means and how that will impact all the states that rely on the Colorado River.
That's a great question. Aridification sounds a little bit scary. And it is really what aridification means is that there's a permanent drying of the ecosystem so that we're seeing a permanent change, not a temporary one, in the amount of water that we're receiving. We've coined this drought through a couple of different academic studies, a hot drought, meaning that there's a lot of years where we've gotten average or near average precipitation, but it's really the temperatures that are driving less water in the reservoir, more evaporation. We're expanding the growing season, that snow's melting off sooner. Those are the things that are all indications that we are experiencing aridification. And like I just said, that means that what we're calling drought may not be a temporary condition. We will always experience wet years like we did this last year, but overall, we're anticipating that as we move deeper into this century, that our water supply will continue to stay dry like it has on average.
And Colby, when you mentioned the growing season, can you just help our listeners understand what that means a little bit more? That's related to agricultural water users?
It's related to the natural ecosystem as well as agricultural water users. So the growing season is typically once the snow melts in an area that gets snow until the first frost sets in. So what we're seeing is that that growing season has already expanded by over a month in some areas. So the natural plants and forest that is there starts using water a month sooner. The same is true for people that can plant crops. We are putting those crops in earlier because the snow's not there. All of these changes in water supply are going to affect the entire Colorado River ecosystem. If you're a farmer, extending your growing season sounds really wonderful. If you're a high elevation farmer, though, and that means that the creek that you rely on to feed your cattle is going dry significantly sooner in the season, and you have to look for outside water resources, that completely changes your entire business operation. And there's farmers and ranchers all over the Upper Basin that cannot farm and ranch the way they have for the last century because of these changes we're seeing.
That's some great insight. I think sometimes because we live in Las Vegas, we have Lake Mead in our backyard, sometimes we forget or don't necessarily realize the diverse water users within the Colorado River Basin, not just the urban water users, but you've got those agricultural water users. And then you mentioned the environment, right? We got to make sure that there's enough water to continue to support the environment. This is some of the challenges that we expect we're going to be experiencing with climate change. With all of that, there are some agreements on the Colorado River that really help guide how the river is operated and determining those shortage volumes that we talked about, those shortage volumes that we've been experiencing over the past few years. So Colby, can you just talk to our listeners a little bit about those agreements? Because I understand that some of them are set to expire in the next couple of years. What's going on with the states to help address those agreements and get that next round of guidelines put into place?
That's a great lead into a whole lot of policy negotiation that's shaping up right now. So if we go back to the turn of the century on the Colorado River, things were much different than they are today. Arizona wasn't using their full allocation of water. California was relying on that allocation of water in excess of what is their apportionment, but in a way that they were legally allowed to use that water. Our cities were rapidly growing, and the onset of the first series of really, really dry years, like you mentioned, that we've seen since the 50s occurred. So there was a flurry of activity at the turn of the century to bring down California's water use, to provide flexibility and tools for, in particular, urban water providers to manage their demands, and for the first time ever to start coordinating reservoir operations and the amount of water that we can use at low elevations in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So prior to 2007, there were no defined shortages on the Colorado River. So every water user knew that there's opportunities where the Secretary of Interior is allowed to reduce their allocation, particularly in the lower basin where the Secretary of Interior is the water master. So they are allowed to decide when the lower basin states, which has 7.5 million acre feet between them, get more than 7.5 million acre feet, what the normal conditions are, and when they get less. That was what was defined in 2007, as well as the amount of water that came from Lake Powell to Lake Mead. One of the things that's changed significantly since 2007 is our understanding of climate change and how much drier the river could actually get. We've also depleted significant reservoir storage because the 2007 guidelines weren't really designed to be durable and sustainable against the hydrology that we got since then. So in a lot of ways, it's been a success. The basin really didn't start experiencing shortage until the last 2 years. We managed through our cooperative partnerships to keep the river out of shortage by doing conservation, putting more water into Lake Mead. But now, like I said, reservoir storage is depleted, and we know the future is drier than we were predicting the last time we negotiated. So this next round of guidelines, one of the biggest things that's going to be negotiated is the reductions that Arizona, Nevada, and California take. And then through a parallel process, what Mexico does with their allocation to reduce and respond to lower reservoir elevations, just like the U.S. does. We will also touch on how much water is released from Lake Powell to Lake Mead. That'll be a part of these guidelines, and what activities need to be done to protect both of those reservoirs when we get to critical elevations. This last year was a really welcome year, in part because, just the year prior, we were approaching losing power pool in Lake Powell. So that was something where emergency actions were taken both downstream and upstream in order to ensure that we did not lose power generation at Lake Powell. So all of those things get thrown on the table. We're also putting drier hydrologic inputs into our model, and we need to come up with a durable set of operating guidelines to guide our communities that rely on the Colorado River into the future. One of the most important things as a water manager is that you need some certainty. We need some predictability. We would like to be able to look at what's projected to come next year and the following year and be able to plan for what reductions might be ahead. That lets us know, for example, what conservation measures we need to do, how we need to message people, whether we're at a use level where we have to implement emergency actions or not. For a farmer, that could be things like the types of crops that you're going to grow, or how long of a contract you're going to enter into with the person that you're supplying, what you're willing to pay for seed that you may or may not be able to use. All of these decisions are super important and depend upon us having some level of predictability about what the future looks like for us. So all of that is in a giant mixing pot that's supposed to come together by 2026, because 2026 is when the current policy expires.
Through these negotiations, is there any possibility that Nevada or Las Vegas is going to get more Colorado River water just from these negotiations?
Bronson, the reality is Nevada's not getting any more water from the Colorado River. When we negotiated the allocations that we have today, Nevada definitely got the short end of the stick. We have to realize that the 4% allocation that Nevada was given was at a time when there was no Las Vegas, when dividing up the river was really based at that time on agriculture and how much we expected agriculture to use. And there's some people that say Nevada's allocation was given to the state just so that if Nevada decided it wanted water later on, they wouldn't have to come back and open it to add us. We're exceeding the amount of water that we're allocated. We're using more water today than the states are allocated. If you look at what the compact contemplated, it was 7.5 million acre feet for the upper basin, 7.5 million acre feet for the lower basin. a million acre foot of tributary water. So that takes you to 16 million acre feet. The treaty with Mexico came in and it put another 1.5 million on top of that. So that's about 17.5 million acre feet of water that those agreements contemplated being used on the river. Our long-term average flow of the river right now is about 14.7 million acre feet. When we look at this century and take off the really wet years, we're south of 13 million acre feet. And we haven't fully grown into those allocations that we were apportioned, particularly the upper basin is not using their full allocation, but we are using about 14 million acre feet a year of water from the Colorado River with about less than 13 million acre feet of inflow. So we have this imbalance today. So I find it very hard to ever come up with the other 6 state governors saying, yep, you know what, Nevada, you can have more water and we're all going to use even less water so that you can have more. I think that also hits on a larger issue at play in these guidelines. There's a lot of folks, in particular tribes, that still don't have quantified water rights on the Colorado River. There are junior priority users within states, meaning the people that get cut first when there's a shortage that want to see that water play out. We have to make some reductions. And for every new use that we add, you're going to have to reduce use somewhere else in order to make up for it. So it becomes really delicate how we contemplate who uses water and how they're able to use water. But I don't think the future of the river for anyone is having more water. I think it's everyone having to figure out how to deal with less water.
Yeah, and even partnerships, right? Because you just indicated that through this process, Nevada is not certainly going to get any more water. But at the same time, we're working with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, right, on some innovative water reuse programming that will not only benefit Southern California, but will also benefit us here in Southern Nevada, providing some additional water through that partnership, correct?
Absolutely. And we get asked the question all the time about what are we doing to augment our water supplies? What are we doing to bring in new water to the valley? There have been grandiose ideas out there like Mississippi River pipelines, bringing water in from the Columbia River. We had people proposing that we haul icebergs down the coast of California. The reality is new water supplies are really expensive. And 80% of this basin is agriculture, and agriculture cannot afford to pay $2,000 an acre foot for water. Really, only the municipalities can. So there will be partnerships to bring in new water supplies like desalination or water reuse. There's some groundwater contamination stuff. There's some small storage projects that will help us capture and use water in different ways. But we're not going to see these huge panacea like we just press a button and all of our water supply issues are gone, because those solutions are incredibly expensive. But over the next 20 years, we are going to usher in even stronger partnerships where we see the ability to augment our water supply through helping other municipalities with those water supply options.
Good point. We can't emphasize enough that we're not going to just bring icebergs down the ocean over here and pipe the water to us. And even though Lake Mead is in our backyard and everybody perceives it as our water here in Southern Nevada, we can't just pull more water out of it for us. Between the 7 states and Mexico, everybody has their entitlement to a portion of that water, which is why we all need to conserve. It's a very collective effort. Nevada's very small share makes up 90% of our water resources here in Southern Nevada, so conservation is essential to our long-term sustainability. Colby, talk about how conservation has helped this community and what additional actions we're taking to protect our water supply.
So when we talk about this community and our conservation journey, the statistic that I like to throw out there is every single person that moved to this valley since 2002 moved here because somebody that already lived here conserved. 2002 was the peak water use for our community. And that's when we really started ramping up our water conservation programs. Since that time, our per capita or per person water use has decreased by over 51%. We're using in total about 33 billion gallons less water than we did in 2002. And we've added 750,000 people to our valley. So what we've done is shown that throughout this century, we can decouple our economic prosperity from our water use. We are able to continue to grow and continue to diversify our economy here in Southern Nevada without continuing to increase the amount of water that we use. Will that be able to continue forever? No, but we are still continuing to make water conservation savings by implementing smart, reasonable water conservation measures. One of those things that's important is AB 356. This went into law a couple of years ago. It requires decorative grass to be removed from businesses by the end of 2026. So this is not grass that people are recreating on. It's not where you're taking your dog to run. It's not the places where your child's playing soccer. It's things that are in medians, along streetscape, in parking lots. That is one thing that's going on right now to help right some of what probably should have never been put in place to begin with. But then we're also looking forward and trying to make anything new coming to the valley as water responsible as possible. So everybody talks about carbon footprint. We're worried about your water footprint, and in particular, your consumptive water footprint. This valley is fairly new. Almost anything that's going into the sanitary sewer is being treated and returned to Lake Mead. So it's not impacting the amount of water we can use. But if you're using it outside or it's not hitting a drain, that's your consumptive water use. When we look at new development, we are saying that consumptive water use needs to be as low as possible. Grass uses over 400 times what desert landscaping uses. So we're in the community right now saying any new development cannot have any turf. A single family home that's built from today forward cannot have living grass. There's a new beautiful artificial turf out there. There's beautiful desert landscaping. We're no longer in a place where we need to have live grass at your house to have a livable community. Take that one step further, you're only allowed to have grass in schools, parks, and cemeteries going forward in new development, the places that we really need those for recreation. We've prohibited evaporative cooling systems, which are probably our second largest consumptive use of water behind those landscaping uses. We've put in pool size limitations because as we limited what people could put in their landscape, we found that the luxury market started to focus on creating very large, audacious pools to take up backyards when turf was no longer an option. We've put a moratorium on golf courses. You cannot install a new golf course in Southern Nevada. And we've also put in water rate changes across all of our municipalities. Every single SNWA member agency has taken steps to continue to use water pricing as a signal to customers of the amount of water that they should be using. Every single municipality has tiered water rates, meaning the more water you use, the more you pay per unit of that water. So when you get your water bill, you can see that as your use increases, the amount per unit that you pay is increasing as well. There have been some really innovative ways that we've done that with taking seasonally adjusted rates that target getting people to change their water use with the seasons. But other municipalities have compressed their tiers, made them smaller, so you get into that more expensive water quicker, and just generally increase the water pricing in those higher tiers to continue to send the message wherever you live in this valley that water's expensive, water's precious, and we need to use it wisely.
Yeah, Kobe, I'm glad you mentioned pricing. Certainly, it's something that every water user experiences, right? Paying that water bill. It's a lot of work that's been going in developing some new conservation measures, really leveling up the conservation that we've been doing here in Southern Nevada. So you got that pricing, those policies that you talked about too, pool size limits, the golf courses, development codes, all of that is part of the policy element that is helping keep us water efficient. And then kind of that third thing is the practice. And that's where all of us as Southern Nevadans come into play. The practice of water efficiency, changing that sprinkler clock 4 times a year, turning it off when it's raining, with those few times we get monsoons, and making sure that if you have any leaks, you're fixing those and you're reporting water waste. It is a community effort. So obviously these new initiatives, like I said, they're really leveling up our conservation here. And we have some folks that maybe aren't practicing conservation as much as others who haven't really complied with all of the needed conservation. Is that about right?
That is true. I joke about what we need the most in our conservation program might be a behavioral psychologist. You talk about getting the practice of saving water, and I couldn't be more truthful that is one of the biggest things that we're constantly chasing, because when we look across the board continually throughout time of where we can save water, one of the biggest areas remains compliance with the seasonal watering schedule. And overall, our compliance is increasing for the first time in many years as a result of these new measures that we've put in place. So that means people following the days of week watering restrictions. We gain significant water savings by just acknowledging that our plants don't need as much water in January as they do in July. And that's really what a lot of these efforts that we're doing, like seasonally adjusted water rates, so water waste enforcement, those are all looking at the ways we get people to comply with the watering schedule. And because the watering schedule changes seasonally, we have to get people to remember that this is a part of their daily life, is changing their watering clock. It's not something that we do that one year that we have a really wet winter and decide to turn our sprinklers off. It's something we should be doing throughout the year. Those things are what really help this community stay in line with our water conservation goals.
Colby, at the end of every podcast, we encourage people to submit questions to us that we can answer while we're here. But most often, we find people go to our social media sites and post their concerns, their comments, their questions there. And we have an entire series of Tap the Truth videos, we call it, that feature you, and we post those on social media. So we thought we'd extend that to our podcast. Do you mind answering some of the questions that we've been getting on our various social media channels?
I'm happy to.
All right. We've got one from Jeff that says, if our allocation diminishes, as it very obviously has, then California's allocation should diminish as well. Again, fix the problem, stop punishing citizens for a problem they didn't create. I think this gets to the heart of the Colorado River agreements and how the river is divided and how shortage impacts the various states. We talked about this just a little bit ago, but Colby, can you tap the truth on this topic?
Sure. And the answer is not very satisfying to most people, which is we have a set of law and policy and agreements and court decrees that go all the way back more than 100 years now that define how water gets used in the Colorado River Basin. The amounts of water that are set between Arizona, Nevada, and California are largely based in law that was written about a century ago. And there was some significant litigation. There's a very famous court case called Arizona versus California, which hit on this very subject of how is shortage shared amongst the states. It spent 60 years in the Supreme Court, Crystal, before that was resolved. And then very shortly after it was resolved in Arizona's favor, they essentially gave away what they won through legislation to the state of California. And that legislation is where CAP, the Central Arizona Project in Arizona, took the junior priority on the river. So what the law says is that we all get reduced proportionally when there's a shortage. But Central Arizona, in order to get funding to construct the Central Arizona Project, which brings Colorado River water all the way to Phoenix and Tucson, takes shortages so that California would not have to bear any additional shortage as the result of that project. So a strict reading of the law says that all the water going to Phoenix, Tucson, and Central Arizona goes away before California takes any shortage on the river. Nevada was left silent in that agreement, so Nevada shares in a proportion of the shortages on the river that's equivalent to our use. There is this adage when we're creating policy that the easiest policy for people to understand is that which is equitable, where everyone is treated the same. And the reality is we are not equitable amongst the agreements that created the Colorado River. Arizona has a junior priority. And then when we get to the most senior rights on the river, the rights that existed before the Boulder Canyon Project Act was put into place. We call these present perfected rights. Those, under a strict reading of the policy, are the last to get cut. And those are largely the farmers in the lower basin. All of the cities were developed after that agriculture came into existence. The cities take reductions before most of the agriculture in the lower basin. Arizona takes shortages before California. But I mentioned that court case for a reason. And the reason is facing the challenges that the Colorado River is facing, from aridification, from drought, from climate change, whatever you want to call it, less water available in the future. We don't have another 60 years for a judge to tell us who gets to use water and who the winners and losers are. And there's a broad recognition of that across the basin. Everyone is going to have to use less. And our policy is going to have to be constructed in a way that's respectful to the agreements that are already in place, the laws that are already in place. And some of those laws are not what people would say is equitable, but it's the law that exists today. And if we can craft that policy, we can get that certainty that we talked about earlier, that certainty that we're able to plan, we're able to know what our community has, and that we're not leaving these decisions up to a judge that doesn't understand our economy, how water gets used, where water gets used, the types of water uses. Those are all decisions we would like to make as a community. And the way we do that is to work together with our neighboring states, not to fight them in court.
So a century ago, the Colorado River gets divided up. About a half century ago, there's a 60-year court case, I think you said. That wasn't 6, that wasn't 16, that was 60, 60, yes. Right?
Yes.
60. And I mean, ultimately, the outcome of that, would you say that Arizona is taking a larger shortage than their proportion in order to account for California's share of the shortage?
Yes. Absolutely. Under the 2007 guidelines, the shortages that were defined just impacted Arizona and Nevada. When we added the drought contingency plan in 2019, California agreed to help stabilize the system because the water that they store in Lake Mead is so valuable. So arguably, they put water on the table that they didn't have to long before they would be required to under a strict reading of the law in order to help stabilize the system. And that's the kind of partnerships and creative thinking that's really going to guide us into the future.
And that has been what has been guiding us just really since, as you have been saying, the turn of the century, right? The early 2000s. Colby, we got one more question for you. You game for one more?
Sure.
This one comes from Robert. And Robert had posted a question about water rates and conservation. Now, I realize the Southern Nevada Water Authority doesn't necessarily set water rates that customers receive on their water bill. That's at the utility level. But here's Robert's question. If water use has decreased by 33 billion gallons, and I believe he's comparing since the drought started in the early 2000s, if water use has decreased by 33 billion gallons, then why have water rates more than doubled in the past 20 years?
So as you mentioned, every person's water bill is defined by their governing municipality. So Henderson, the Las Vegas Valley Water District, the city of North Las Vegas, the city of Boulder City, that's who your water bill comes from. There are charges that all of those municipalities pay to SNWA. And one of those charges, for example, is an infrastructure charge. We needed to, as Lake Mead dropped, build a third intake and a pump station associated with it so that we could get water physically out of Lake Mead if its level continued to decline. And we actually turned that pump station on last April. That project cost over $1.5 billion. So what we needed to do was divide those costs across all of the people that are using them. So even if you're using less water, we physically would not have been able to get water to you without investing in that infrastructure. But the reality is your water bill doesn't just include the third intake. It includes all the pipelines that bring water from the lake to your home. There are thousands of miles of pipeline buried in this valley that form our water infrastructure. And we have to constantly be maintaining them in order to keep our water losses down, to not have water leaks. And I think if any of you have run into a major water leak, how disruptive that can be. We have one of the best loss rates in the nation in terms of keeping our infrastructure well maintained. But there's all sorts of other costs. As everyone who looks around know, we are not insulated from inflation, just like people buying groceries and buying gas right now. The costs of our raw materials have gone up significantly. The largest power users in the valley are water agencies. It takes a lot of power to move water around, particularly uphill from Lake Mead into this valley. So as electricity rates are rising, so is the cost of us delivering you that water. And all of those things get put into your water bill every year. So that's why people are seeing their costs increase.
And that gets put into your water bill. And every time you go to the tap, the Southern Nevada Water Authority and your water utility is meeting the demand. That is what you are paying for. You are paying for that reliability. You are paying for that treatment. You are paying for that delivery of water that is a necessary resource for all of us to use to be delivered directly into your home without worry. And that is what it takes in order to ensure that we continue to have a sustainable quality of life here, a quality of life that we have all come to know and appreciate. Colby Pellegrino, Deputy General Manager of Resources for the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Thank you so much for joining us on the Water Smarts podcast and sharing your expertise with our listeners.
Thank you, Bronson and Crystal. Take care.
Well, Crystal, another good conversation. You know, I really love when we're able to zoom out on the Colorado River, zoom out on Lake Mead, zoom out on our water resources and how we're using water. And I think that really helps our community to get a little broader perspective of our water supply and some of the challenges that we're contending with.
Yeah, I agree. The zoom out, right? Because this is big picture stuff that we're talking about. And we really look at how we manage our water resources and how things are allocated along the Colorado River Basin. And we have, 7 states and the country of Mexico, 40 million people that share this river. So I'm glad Colby spent a little time on talking about the Colorado River Compact, which we know is 100 years old. And
Right.
People harp on us all the time about it. They're like, why? Why don't you change that? That's ridiculous. We were tiny back, 100 years ago. We weren't the state or the Southern Nevada that we are today. But as Colby said, it's so complicated. It's not just that easy to go in and say, hey, we've grown and we would like more water. And it's just not going to happen. You have to have everybody agree it's going to take an act of Congress to change that. And that is just not feasible. So I think it's good that she kind of laid that out and talking about how it sat for 60 years.
Yeah, and what sat for 60 years right there was a court case between Arizona and California, right? So you've got just 2 states that were going at it with litigation with regards to water rights on the Colorado River, and that took 60 years. Now imagine 7 states going at it. 60 years is going to look like it was just a nap. So it is really a matter about avoiding litigation, building more flexibility into that rigid Colorado River Compact with new agreements layering on top of it. That's what they ultimately call the law of the river. And that really brings us into more of the 21st century, being able to have those innovative agreements and partnerships, like you mentioned, is absolutely critical going forward. And we are really pleased with the partnerships that we have and look forward to extending those even further. And that's it for this episode here on the Water Smarts podcast. We hope you subscribe and join us next time. You can send us questions. We just heard a few of them today. Send them to us at watersmarts@snwa.com. That email is watersmarts@snwa.com. We'll get back to you with an answer. You might hear that question on a future episode. And we hope you join us here next time on Water Smarts.